Buck Registry's Big Buck Podcast, episode number 97, 12 Dead Deer, with special guest Deer Project leader Dan Bergeron, New Hampshire Fish and Game. Big Buck Registry is a virtual museum of hunting stories. We preserve a piece of Americana by interviewing and recording hunters about their hunts and experiences from across the country. And who knows, maybe we'll learn a thing or two along the way that'll help us take our hunt to the next level.
Hey everybody, this is Kirsten Godfrey, the Kentucky Huntress. You're up for another amazing podcast with Jay and Dusty on the Big Buck Registry's Deer Hunting Podcast.
Hey, this is Matt Duff.
And Jeff Danker.
We're Major League Bow Hunter, and you're listening to the best podcast on the internet, the Big Buck Registry.
Hi, this is Sean Lupkel with Heartland Bow Hunter.
Hey, this is Michael Huntucker with Heartland Bow Hunter.
And you're listening to my favorite podcast on iTunes, the Big Buck Registry's Big Buck Podcast.
Welcome to the show. This is Jay Scott, your host of the Big Buck Registry's Big Buck Deer Hunting Podcast. And I am also joined by the Buckeye, the deer naming legend, Dusty Phillips from Ohio. What's up, Dusty?
Oh, man. It's been a great week, dude.
Yeah? What happened?
What happened? About 10.5 inches, 10 3/4 inches. About an inch and an 8 spurs. That's what happened.
Boom. Nice.
Boom.
Got yourself a
come
long
running
beard,
in.
didn't
Come running in like a I don't know what, man. I mean, just come running in. It was pretty crazy. One of the best experiences of my life, shooting a big old gobbler here in Ohio. So, yeah, it's been a great week. You know, it's turkey season here in Ohio, and I know you're a little jealous because turkey hasn't opened in New Hampshire yet.
Yeah, it opens tomorrow.
But I'm chasing number 2, hopefully this weekend, see if I can't lay the hammer on old chubby gobbler.
That's awesome. And now you used a firearm that's been in your family for a while, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, it was my wife's grandfather's shotgun. Looked it up. I think it's a Central Arms is who it's made by, and the manufacturing date is like from 1908 to 1930, so it's got to be somewhere in there. I didn't get a chance to look up serial numbers in a particular book to see exactly what year it was manufactured, but yeah, it was single shot 12 gauge and just shooting 2 3/4 number 4 turkey loads.
That's pretty cool, man. Congratulations.
Yeah,
that's your first bird, right?
Yeah, definitely first bird.
That's fantastic. It is quite a rush, and it's different than deer hunting, that's for sure. But
yeah, it's an accomplishment that if you've never shot one, I definitely encourage you to get out there and you know, there's no mistakes in turkey hunting, really.
We do have a couple of announcements, Dusty. One is that we have a brand new podcast app that you can download. It's an official Big Buck Deer Hunter 2015 app that you can actually search in the App Store on iTunes now.
How cool is that, Jay?
Is that not the best?
Yeah, you know, it's one of the things that we just added to want our fans to be able to get the app for the Big Buck Registry.
The app is live on iTunes now. So if you're listening to this on the podcast app, you can actually go to the App Store, type in Big Buck Deer Hunter 2015, and you'll see our app that we built just so you can listen to the show. You can also find it, and I don't know if it's quite there yet, but you can find it on Google Play and on the Android apps. So they're all there on every platform you can imagine. But yeah, so if you are an iTunes listener and you'd like to switch out of the podcast app to listen to the show, we actually have our own app. So check that out, and it'll be
very cool.
It'll be at bigbuckregistry.com/app if you want to check it out. We had one caller this week, Dusty. I want to play this for you real quick.
Hi, I'm Brad Boswell, Greenwood, Indiana. I shot a 135 in Jackson County, Indiana. When the arrow passed through the deer, it bounced off the ground, hit another doe, and killed it. So got a 135 and a doe in one shot. Thank you very much. You guys do a great job.
How about that?
Very cool.
Imagine that. Bouncing off the ground and then hitting the doe too.
Very cool.
Well, thank you, Brad, for that story. That line is always there for anybody that wants to call in their quick deer story. 724-613-2825. 724-613-2825. Always there. Open hotline, open deer hunting story telephone number for you to call in and tell us your story. We'll play right here on the air every time. One other announcement is that we still have the pledge page up and going. So if you'd like to pledge for the show, it's bigbuckregistry.com/pledge. You can go there, read all about the Big Buck Registry, how we got started, what it means to us, our mission statement, and why we need your help to keep this show up and running and pay the bills. So bigbuckregistry.com/pledge. Dusty, who do we have on the show today?
We're going to talk to a deer biologist, Jay.
We've had some great deer biologists on the show.
Oh, absolutely.
Grant Woods, Jim Stickles,
Dr. Carl Miller. All these great guys have been on the show. Now we've got Dan Bergeron, who's the deer project leader for the state of New Hampshire and a deer biologist. And the reason we're having him on the show, we've got a few different topics we're going to cover, but the big elephant in the room, as I'm calling it, is the 12 dead deer that died of enterotoxemia in southern New Hampshire over the winter just a couple months ago due to a feeding situation that went awry. Yeah, it's one of them things that it was huge viral. There was a lot of unanswered questions with that situation. And, the biologist agreed to join with us and talk a little bit more detail on what we can do as hunters and conservationists and as people that like to feed deer. Even if you're not a hunter, this can relate to something that you're doing.
Right.
So, with that being said, that Dan's going to be able to break down a lot of subjects that are very important in keeping your deer alive in the wintertime.
Yeah, and he gets into, where this is an issue and where it's not, like geographically, and definitely in northern states, this can become an issue where the snow runs deep for a long time.
Absolutely.
We're going to cover a little bit about the state of Fish and Game financially and what they're doing to try to raise money. Talk about the potential moose hunt in New Hampshire that might be canceled. He clarifies a lot of that stuff, and we get into the actual subject matter of, can New Hampshire actually be a big rack deer hunting state like Ohio? And I have my doubts, and we'll see what he says.
Yeah, you don't know until you actually talk to somebody that's out there doing the studies and getting the factual information.
Right. Well, we cover a lot of great topics. We go deep, get to the inside scoop on a lot of these hot topics that came up, especially with the deer feeding catastrophe out there in New Hampshire and the southern New Hampshire during the winter. But let's get Dan on.
Let's do it.
Dan Bergeron, welcome to the Big Buck Registry's Big Buck Deer Hunting Podcast. How are you, Dan?
Not bad, yourself. Thanks for having me.
I'd just like to talk to you, Dan. It's an honor to have somebody from my home state of New Hampshire on the show. We don't get that all that often. And,
Very good.
You're unique because not only are you in New Hampshire, but you're the deer project leader for the state of New Hampshire. You're a deer biologist, and you know a lot about deer, which is our favorite subject.
Okay.
So thanks for joining us, man.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, Dan, the elephant in the room is the 12 dead deer that went viral all over Facebook, Outdoor Life, every magazine I can think of. There was an article online about the 12 dead deer that died in New Hampshire due to a feeding problem.
Mm-hmm.
And we want to get to the bottom of what happened over there. What's the inside scoop? What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so a little bit of background on that is I received a call from one of our regional biologists who'd gotten a call from one of the conservation officers who covers that kind of southeastern portion of the state on the seacoast.
Yeah.
It was actually relatively close to where he lives. One of his neighbors actually called him. He'd been walking in the woods and came upon, four or so dead deer. Seemed like a strange thing to him, just kind of how they died and the fact that they all looked, pretty healthy. So he called our regional biologist. They went out to investigate, and as they went out, they just kind of started finding one deer after another as they kept kind of checking the area. They field necropsied 8 of the deer that they found. And again, there was no sign of predation on any of these deer. That some of them had died at different stages. So, some might have been a little older than others, but the most they saw in any of them was maybe a little bit of chewing on the hind end, but really no sign of predation. They checked, fat on them and femur marrow fat, which was all good for that time of year. No signs of trauma from vehicle collisions, and really the main thing that they noticed was bloody diarrhea. And then when they got into the intestines, same thing. There was blood in the intestines, where typically you should be finding, pelleted scat and things like that. And then also, just the rumen or the stomach, all the chambers of the rumen were just completely full of a number of different things, but predominantly corn, what appeared to be pelleted feed, a grain of some sort, and then and also hay. So
okay.
we ended up taking one of those deer to our state vet, or the veterinary pathologist who did a more in-depth necropsy and confirmed that they died from Enterotoximia, which is a condition that's pretty well documented in deer. And what happens is when they're fed large quantities of foods high in carbohydrates, kind of suddenly, there's a number of different things it can do, but this particular condition, Enterotoxemia, it builds up, causes a buildup of this specific type of bacteria in their intestines, which releases toxins which can kill them.
What town was this in?
So they were found in Southampton,
okay.
New Hampshire, which is down on the seacoast. So, there's a number of reasons that we recommend to people not to feed deer. This being one of them. There's another condition called lactic acidosis that's kind of similar, but that's a buildup of lactic acid, which kind of disrupts the chemistry in the stomach and makes it so they can't digest their food properly. But this particular thing, it wasn't as though there was anything wrong with the food. It was how the food was introduced. As a deer's diet changes kind of gradually and naturally with natural foods as the seasons change, it has microorganisms in its stomach that also change, that help them digest those different food sources. Mm-hmm. So they have specific organisms in their stomach in the winter that help them digest things like, woody browse and things like that, which is primarily what they should be eating. So when they're rapidly introduced something like corn or grains or really any drastic change in their diet that time of year, they don't have the bacteria in their stomach to deal with it. Or it can cause a buildup of a specific type of bacteria, which can lead to their deaths. And it's happened. It's been documented most of deer's natural range where they exist.
Gotcha. So this occurred in, was it February of 2015?
Yeah, I believe it was back in February sometime.
Okay.
Yeah.
Gotcha. And
one of the things that we had going on here, which I think kind of helped lead to this, is we had February was a very severe month this winter for us. It was one of the most severe Februarys we saw. So winter kind of came late. So I think there was probably a lot of people that started putting food out late as opposed to starting earlier on in the season. And when you put that food out late, it can be dangerous, and you can see things like this happen.
Now that's a good point. That's something I want to talk about. Is New Hampshire this year, we had over 48 inches of snow that fell and stayed. And I recall I've got game camera pictures of bare ground as late as late December, like the last week in December.
Yeah.
And then it started to come a little bit in January, but by the end of January and through all of February, it just piled on.
Yeah.
The temperatures were fairly brutal here and there, but definitely the snow was impactful, and probably, and correct me if I'm wrong, Dan, I'm just trying to understand the situation here. The snow covered the ground to the point where a deer couldn't get some of the natural browse that it would be used to. So it's almost like you've got this interaction between humans and deer that went awry, and that good intentions probably to try to help the deer, but in fact, because of the deer's natural abilities to digest and the things that are just naturally found in its gut, the organisms, the symbiotic organisms that it needs to help break down food to survive, changed throughout the season. And it was so late into the season that all those microorganisms that could potentially digest corn weren't there. Is that kind of accurate?
Yeah, that's definitely accurate. And again, so for example, if someone had started feeding deer corn right at the end of the fall and kept it up throughout the winter, it wouldn't develop this condition, this, enterotoxemia or lactic acidosis, because it would have those organisms in its stomach that it needs to digest that type of food. It's why, for example, deer don't, there's no concern over this in the fall or the summer or anything when they're getting into corn and fields, because that's a naturally available food that time of year. So they slowly get introduced to it as it comes out. So their stomachs can adjust to it. We still don't recommend, even though there's ways that you can lessen some impacts like that where you won't get these conditions, we still don't recommend people feed because, there's a number of other negative side effects to feeding. One of them is increased vehicle collisions, which, in the northern part of the state, there's a lot of feeding that goes on, and our conservation officer up there is pretty much, last I heard, he's getting close to 100 roadkill deer, in the northern part of it, and basically the town of Pittsburgh in the far northern part of New Hampshire.
Right.
Feeding's kind of become a competition between people to see who can get the most in their yard. It's drawing them out of the deer yards, which, it is difficult for us because, really long term for deer to survive in New Hampshire, we need quality winter habitat, and most of what we do to try and manage that habitat is through cooperative agreements with foresters. Over 80% of the forest land in the state's privately owned. So as people are putting food out and drawing deer out of these deer yards, it's tough to convince these people how important they are if they're not seeing as many deer in the winter. And long-term feeding isn't really a way that we can sustain deer in New Hampshire. It's really going to depend on quality habitat, which is tough to convince people to actively manage or keep on the ground if they're not seeing deer in those yards.
That's interesting. So instead of opening up a bag of corn and dumping it in your backyard when the snow's 4 feet deep, you probably should spend all year round just trying to enhance the natural habitat that's there, so that they'll go and stay there.
Yeah, absolutely. And, certainly if you're a large enough landowner and there's other benefits to that. If you're doing habitat management, you're going to be benefiting other wildlife species as well. But, there's, little things people can do. You can chop down some trees on your property. If you got some areas that they can get at that, the tops of the trees in the wintertime. You can promote different types of stands. Certainly if you have some good softwood cover, you can promote that. Maybe place some small cuts near that for browse for them, and promote maybe growth of some oaks if you got an oak stand. So you try and promote more acorn crops, but that certainly long term is going to be a lot more beneficial than putting corn down. And a lot of these people spend quite a bit of money. They're putting tons of corn out, so that I feel that money could be better directed towards some habitat management on their property as opposed to just putting the feed out.
Right. I've seen corn, I bought corn before, and it's not cheap, and it's got to add up, especially in the quantities that you're talking about in Pittsburgh.
Oh, absolutely, yeah, and to do it, to do it at least, I hate to say the right way because again, there's so many other negative side effects, but to do it to lessen some of those impacts, you gotta start early. You gotta put a lot out, and you gotta keep it going because once you start, you really can't stop. And we're concerned about disease transmission. Fortunately, we don't have CWD in New Hampshire yet, but, there's a number of other diseases that can be transmitted from deer to deer contact. One of the things that's a concern is rabies.
Right.
There's been some cases in New York and Pennsylvania where they believe deer have contracted rabies through sharing feed sites with things like raccoons. I had a trail camera up in my backyard just on an apple tree, and, I got a video of a deer and a raccoon fighting over a couple apples under one tree. So, it's not a hard stretch to believe that stuff like that goes on. And in the last few years we've seen, there's been some states that have been seeing deer with rabies, and, there's other, fibromas and, the deer warts, mange, deer can get mange, and those are all things that can be spread through contact. Most of them aren't fatal to the deer, but certainly it decreases their overall health, and certainly it decreases their appearance.
Right. Gotcha. One of the things that I wanted to kind of point out is, I in my town, I get a call when there's a deer that goes down fairly frequently, because I'll go and I'll take it and I'll make meat out of it if I can, or use the carcass if it's so beat up from getting hit by a car. I'll use it on a coyote pile or something like that, or give it to a coyote hunter who I might hunt with now and then. And there was last winter, there was a situation where there was a clear deer trail going across the road, and there was a small buck hit, and I called Fish and Game, and I was allowed to pick it up. And come to find out that this person that was feeding deer on the other side of the road, and their intentions were to help to keep them alive. But in fact, they had they were responsible for the death of at least 3 deer that Fish and Game knows of, because they had to cross from a habitat that I know for sure is great wintering habitat, cross the road to get to the feed. Otherwise, they probably wouldn't go there. So, and the intentions was to save them, and in fact, they ended up killing too many.
Yeah, and that's what we see pretty frequently. And when this press release came out about the deer that died in Southampton, we started getting a lot of calls about dead deer. And we received a call, a similar situation where there were 2 roadkill deer that a gentleman had gotten possession tags for, and when he was processing them, he noticed a lot of corn in the stomach, so he gave us a call. Myself and one of the other biologists went out and checked into it, and he told us how, year after year deer are getting hit in the same spot. So we, similar thing, found a trail that crossed the road, followed it a little ways through really poor winter cover, an area that typically you wouldn't expect to find that amount of deer activity, and it led right up to a feed pile. So we got another situation where there's, several deer there that we know about that were likely wouldn't have been crossing that road and headed up to the feed site.
So it's almost like if you're gonna do it, and you really shouldn't, but if you're, and I'm talking about New Hampshire. Now, in other parts of the country, like where Dusty lives in Ohio, feeding deer might not be a problem because corn is available pretty much all year round there. And there isn't a snow cover, if I'm not mistaken, that would really keep them from getting to corn. Does that sound
right?
So different areas will have different habitat needs for the deer.
Yeah, certainly all those risks aren't there depending on where you might live. So things could be different. Certainly the disease transmission risk is always there. And I'm fairly certain Ohio is a CWD state.
Yep.
Yeah, that's correct.
So that would be a concern in a state like Ohio. I'm one of my major concerns kind of overall just managing deer is threats like CWD and things like that, mostly because it's just spread so rapidly in a pretty short period of time that I imagine it's only a matter of time before it gets here, as opposed to whether or not we're ever going to find it. I feel it's just a matter of time. We're fortunate that we haven't found it yet, but always vigilant, hoping it doesn't show up. But
right. Yeah, you don't want it to ever show up. So if you're going to feed deer, and again, I'm not promoting this. I don't think it's necessarily a good idea, especially in New Hampshire. Probably goes for Maine, Vermont, all the northern states that just get a pile of snow all year round. Yeah. Especially when we're talking about, and correct me if I'm wrong, it's enterotoxemia is what we're talking about here. Is that the
enterotoxemia and lactic acidosis are really the 2 conditions specifically related to the feed. Yeah.
Okay, so basically you've got a condition where the bacteria that build up in the stomach, because there are no digestive whatever to break down corn, increase in the stomach and throw off these toxins, which can then lead to extensive bleeding and no digestion, and just the problems go on and on from there.
I'm going to bump in there. You was talking a little bit, Dan, about, like I said, we're not promoting winter feeding in New Hampshire by no means. What is something that is a better feed to use that will lower the chances of the deer getting sick from eating it?
Or is there a feed better than corn, or doesn't it matter?
Well, it's all dependent on when and how you're introducing it and what else they've been eating. So certainly if there's something out there that's not quite as high in carbohydrates, but there's less of a likelihood if it's introduced slowly. Those are things that lessen those impacts. But again, there's a number of other things like vehicle collisions that no matter what you're feeding them, if it's drawn on the crossroads more frequently, it's still a risk there. So, I know there's, I'm not too familiar with what's in some of the commercial feeds. I know there's some that try and mix it up where it's not just straight grains. They put fiber and things like that in it. So something like that would potentially have less of a possibility, but there's some studies that suggest that even it's not necessarily just carbohydrates, that just rapid shifts in diet of any type can lead to those conditions. So it's a risk. It's particularly mainly if you're introducing it suddenly is really the big deal. And that was the case here. You know, the food was introduced suddenly to these deer, so they just weren't prepared for it. But you know, I always hate to talk about proper ways to do it, just because there's no way to get rid of all the potential negative side effects. So right. I feel like when I start giving better ways to do it, people take it as kind of a tacit sign that it's okay to do it. So
right, completely, yeah. You know, and the major thing that reading articles and listening to you is that don't wait till middle of January. You got 3 foot of snow to dump out a bag of corn. That's not the correct way to do it.
Yeah, that's certainly the most dangerous thing to do in terms of because you're just adding one more thing on top of all the other possible negative side effects. So starting early and doing it throughout the winter and but again. If you're going to do it, be prepared to spend a lot of money. If you're going to do it to try and lessen most of the impacts, and really these things, unless you got a large area far away from roads where you're willing to truck tons and tons of feed out throughout the entire winter.
I was going to say, it's like
issues.
If the ideal scenario, if you're going to feed, is to do it for a very long period of time, starting probably in the fall and carrying it all the way through the spring at a minimum.
Yeah.
Bringing it to a spot where there are no roads within the general vicinity, so there's no chance of them crossing anywhere. And then almost like you got to spread it out, like in small piles, and get it to where they are and where they don't want to leave, but not put it in one giant pile. Like you got to spread it out amongst a fairly large area.
Yeah, and that's certainly, there's some states that have, in the past they've put out, we don't recommend it, but if you're going to do it, this is how to do it type of brochures, which, I go back and forth on that because again, I feel like as soon as you start telling people, the correct way to do it, they kind of take it as they don't take you seriously when you talk about the risks. So, it's kind of a double-edged sword when you start talking about the correct way to feed.
Well, let's ask the ultimate question here, Dan. If you didn't bring corn to them or didn't make it available to them, would they survive anyway?
Yeah, it's tough to say. It's probably on an individual deer basis, but certainly most of the time, probably yes, they probably would. I'm not going to say that there's not situations where feed doesn't help certain deer. It's tough to judge. If this deer would have survived or this deer wouldn't have, but they're adapted to survive these severe winters. They did so long before people started putting tons and tons of corn out for them. And they did fine. And my point of view is these are wild animals. If we need to, if the only way we can sustain them on the landscape is by providing, human provided food, then we've done something wrong as managers. If we're dependent on feeding them human foods.
Gotcha.
They're wild animals and they should be treated as such is my point of view on that.
Dan, were you able to visit the site of the incident?
Not that specific site, but shortly after that, again, we started getting a lot of phone calls. So, there was another incident in, Guilford, New Hampshire, where a woman had actually emailed us pictures of a deer that was in her yard. The deer was, basically laying in her backyard very close to the house, looking and like she was in pretty poor shape, very lethargic. By the time somebody got back here, the deer had already died. One of our conservation officers went and checked it out and again noticed bloody diarrhea. So he contacted us and we performed a necropsy on that one. And again, that one was another one that died from enterotoxemia. All the organs were in good shape. She had good body fat, pregnant with twin fawns, really good marrow fat content, but stomach full of hay and corn, and again, no feces in the intestines, and they were just all full of blood.
Wow.
So again, that was another one. So that one I was able to get out on scene, and we went out to where the deer was found and, looked for a feeding site. We did find one feeding site with a small amount of corn. We were trying to locate another where there might have been hay, but it was in a kind of a, small suburban area where there was a lot of houses with forested patches in between. So it was probably just a matter of, getting into the right spot where the bigger feed sites were. But, so yeah, I don't think that particularly these two conditions are overly common. I don't think we're losing a lot of deer this way. I don't think it's anything that's driving the population down. But it probably happens more so than we realize because again, unless you have a really large incident like the one that we had in Southampton, if you're just finding one or two dead deer, if they're even found before they're scavenged or whatever, a lot of people don't, it doesn't ring a lot of alarm bells when you find one dead deer in a winter, or two dead deer in a winter by themselves, particularly if it's a relatively severe winter. So.
Right. Gotcha. Now, do the people who were involved in the incident, is it illegal to put out corn, or is it's just something that isn't illegal?
No,
just try to regulate it.
Yeah, it's not illegal. We discourage it. We have informational pamphlets that we hand out, and we try and send out. We put reminders on our Facebook page and press releases during the winter just to remind people of the risks of doing it. There were, I believe, up to 4 feed sites that were located in Southampton where the deer were found dead. It was an unfortunate case of people thought they were helping, they weren't aware of the risks, and they were devastated when they found out. They stopped immediately, and so it would be legal if you intentionally set out to kill the animal, but that certainly was not the case here. This was the case of people thinking that they were helping, not knowing the risks. The good thing is that it did get so much publicity that a lot of people are more familiar about some of the risks, and this one in particular,
right?
Because it's not very common. The vehicle collisions are much more common, I think, than something like this. So this is just something that kind of brought it to the forefront of people's minds. So.
Right, gotcha. Now, one of the things I couldn't help notice this is whenever there was a post about it, we posted it on our site. And other sites, seemed like there was always one or two people that just said this was complete BS. What do you have to say to those people? There's certain people that no matter what you tell them, they're not going to believe you. They're set in their ways. This particular incident. We field necropsy the deer. We had a veterinary pathologist that confirmed it on another deer. This is something that happens. It's well documented throughout whitetail range. It's also a condition that's fairly well documented in livestock. Sudden changes in diet and ruminants like that. It's really it's really not up for debate what killed these deer. We know what killed them. Right.
So to say that that's not something that could happen. It's well documented. It's well known. A lot of people say, I've been feeding deer for years. I see the same one over and over again. It's got a specific mark on it, so I know I'm not hurting them. Which I, may be true for some of those deer. But, when you're feeding 50 deer, there's no way you're going to be able to tell individual deer. And, deer move around a lot in the winter. Some of them migrate, miles upon miles from deer yards to, particularly the deer yards, but then from deer yards to feed sites, and to think that what's happening to every one of those deer. Like for example, this one individual deer that we found dead. I'm sure if someone was feeding 12 deer and one of them went missing, they probably wouldn't think much of it. So,
right.
Again, the 100 deer that get hit, and that's an annual occurrence. Pretty much every winter we're getting anywhere from 50 to 100 deer in Pittsburgh that are getting hit on Route 3 crossing to get to feed sites. And, some of those deer might be crossing the road anyway, but certainly not that volume of deer. Pittsburgh, New Hampshire, it's, Route 3 in Pittsburgh, New Hampshire is not a heavily traveled road. So to be seeing that volume it's not a heavily traveled road, and there's not high deer densities in Pittsburgh. So, to be seeing that volume of vehicle collisions, there's no doubt in my mind that a lot of those are due to feeding.
Right. And those deer yards are tremendously large, if I'm not mistaken. I spent some time up there a few years ago, and it's just, when you find a yard, there's like 100, 200 deer there sometimes.
Yeah, particularly in the northern part of the state where there's kind of some larger complexes. I mean, in that area of the state, we got deer migrating down from Canada to get to some of these yards,
right.
Across the border. And one of our biologists has, followed deer trails, 20 miles or, and then just got tired and couldn't do it anymore. So, these deer are moving around a lot. And, that's another thing to consider is that, is deer movement. And so, you could have a situation where, you thought you were doing everything the right way. You started feeding, early on in the fall. You continued it through the winter, into the spring. In which case, the deer that have been consistently coming there should be fine, at least in terms of these two conditions. But when the winter starts to break up, deer start to move around a lot. So you could have a deer come from a few miles away that never came to your feed site all winter, and he doesn't have those bacteria in his stomach to handle the corn or the grain that you have out. And now all of a sudden you got new deer coming to that site late in the winter that weren't introduced to it early enough, and they could be dying. And again, those might be deer that, you weren't familiar with, while you were watching them, feeding them, and, they could move off, die away from your feed site, and you'd never know about it.
Gotcha. That's fascinating. So what should we be doing if we're not going to feed deer? What should we be doing, with our habitats? Or do you have some tips and pointers on what we can do, especially in the northern states, to enhance the wintering habitats for these deer?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's in large part, most of it's going to be large landowners, in the northern part of the state. Really, you're going to need some sizable portions of land you're going to need some, your typical deer yard is, the primary thing you're looking for is mature softwood cover, dense, a dense canopy there so that it's trapping the snow. And you're going to need, whether it's for a number of landowners that can kind of work together, but, we got some sites in the northern part of the state that, they're getting to the age now where they're dying off. So, you need to conserve some of those older stands, but you also have to have some other stands online that are younger, that when those stands start to, when you need to go in and thin those, that you got new stands that are going to be providing cover when you go in and do some work in those. If you can do some cutting, some clear cutting, adjacent to those areas, to provide browse for them, that's important. So it's things like that, particularly in the northern part of the state. It's difficult for small landowners to do stuff, but again, if you're you're near one of these areas, anything you can do to kind of add to it, if you can keep some softwood open that might act as a corridor from one property to the other, that's helpful. If you're adjacent to a large chunk of softwood cover and you got some, you don't have softwoods, but perhaps you can do some cutting that might create some browse for them in the winter. Things like that. And in New Hampshire Fish and Game partially funds a position over with the University of New Hampshire with Cooperative Extension, where we have an extension wildlife specialist who's also a forester, who knows a lot about deer and a lot about deer wintering areas. He's happy to help landowners and give them tips on forestry practices they can do and different management they can do on their property to create habitat for deer.
Gotcha. Very cool. Well, excellent. Well, thanks for bringing some light to that whole subject. It's, I think, we read about it. We kept reading the same article over and over, and we really wanted to talk to somebody that knew it from the inside.
Yeah.
That clears a lot of stuff up. Dust, you got anything else you want to add to that, or any questions about that subject?
No, that was great. Great conversation about the situation that happened there.
Cool. Dan, let's move on to Fish and Game itself. You work for Fish and Game, if I'm not mistaken, and I'm frequently getting emails from Fish and Game about a hearing that's coming up or has already occurred, or something that's coming up that is trying to keep Fish and Game funded. And I don't know a lot about what's going on over there. Can you fill us in on the inside scoop?
Yeah, so we're not unlike many other states. Most fish and game departments, at some point, some agencies have found a way to move away from this, but primarily our funding comes from hunting and fishing licenses, and pretty much nationwide. There's been a declining trend in license sales. So, when that's your primary source of funding, and sales keep dropping off, it's kind of tough to keep pace. On top of, declines in license sales, we've also kind of been, additionally work is kind of added up over the years, particularly with, things like law enforcement with search and rescue. That's a pretty sizable chunk of money that really there's no funding source for. So really costs have been increasing and revenues have been declining over the years. So it's difficult to keep pace. And, we have our fish and game fund, which was kind of at one point, a source of money to kind of dip into has basically just been eroding over the years as we haven't been able to keep up with costs and have been taking less and less money in. The department's done a lot of things, trying to cut costs, and there's a lot of people have been retiring in those positions or basically going unfilled. So you get a lot more work kind of getting dispersed among a lot fewer people. And we've done a good job kind of keeping things running as they always have been, which I guess unfortunately the public, it wasn't quite as obvious that maybe we were having as many issues as we were because we were still providing all the services that we usually do. The issues become now that basically we're to the point that if we don't get another source of funding or we can't increase revenues one way or another, that it's going to get to the point where we're going to need to lay off more full-time people, and those services are going to have to take a hit, and that we're not going to be able to provide everything that we have historically to the residents of the state. So there's the big thing right now really is there's with the budget, the state's budget. There was a lot of stuff that our director and a number of other people had kind of worked out with the governor of ways to kind of fill some of these gaps with funding. One of the things was to allow the director a little more authority to set fees on his own. Right now, any fee changes have to be done through the legislature, and legislators typically don't like to start talking about fee increases, particularly if it's an election year. So,
good point.
So it's things like that. We have not had a license fee increase, I believe, since 2003 or so. So it's been 12 or 13 years, if I'm not mistaken, since our last license increase. And again, like everybody else, gas prices go up, heating costs for our buildings, all the work that we do at the hatcheries, I know the cost of fish food alone, there's things you don't typically think about, but all those costs have gone up, and we just haven't been able to keep pace with our traditional funding sources.
Gotcha. So the goal is to be able to raise more money through licensing. Is that correct?
That's one of them. There's a number of other things that were in there. I know, and again, I should probably know better, but I kind of leave that to the people who know more about finances than I do. I stick to the deer stuff.
Yeah,
but,
no, I don't blame you. I understand.
Yeah, but no, there's a number of things they're looking at. There's been talk about different ways to get non-hunters to kind of help pay some of the costs for because really everybody in the state benefits from the work that we do, through whether it's wildlife watching or access to lakes for fishing or just for kayaking or canoeing in general. So there's been talk about maybe small permit fees for things like canoes or kayaks to generate some money and different funding sources like that. One of the other things is, potentially a portion of maybe the room and meals tax that the state has. But, the issue is that we're not the only state agency who's experienced this stuff either. And so there's a lot of people sitting around the table and really not enough to go around. But So we're working at it, but the more really the best thing that people that kind of understand what the department provides, we can call legislators all we want, but it doesn't really do much. They kind of know what that we're going to be asking for more money, but if people from the general public just call up their legislator and tell them how important the department is to them, and the services that we provide, and the income that comes into the state through wildlife watching and hunting and fishing. I mean, we're talking millions and millions of dollars that probably, if not more, when you start combining consumptive and non-consumptive uses of wildlife. So,
right.
We provide important services to the state. So,
gotcha. Yeah, is that unique to New Hampshire? I mean, are you aware of other problems that may be happening in other fish and game departments or DNRs around the country?
Yeah, it's certainly not unique to New Hampshire. There's, and I don't know specifically which states have found, new funding sources, but it's a fairly common problem for a lot of different states, fish and game or DNR agencies. Some states have gotten things passed, like getting portions of the room and meals tax, and they've kind of gotten away from, or a lot of times it's there's been some sort of legislative action that starts getting them general fund money or some other form where they're not dependent, solely on license sales, and that's really, what we're looking for a solution like that. But, we've come up with some things that would potentially get us the money. It's just, it's getting everybody to agree on it and getting the laws passed. So.
Gotcha.
But yeah, it's certainly not unique to New Hampshire. There's a number of other states that have experienced and are experiencing the same things, but other states that again, have kind of shifted gears and have found a way out and kind of changed from that traditional funding source.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, let's move on to another topic. And this is a big one for New Hampshire because it's so unique to New Hampshire, and that's the moose lottery. And
yeah.
I had this article come across my desk. I sent it over to you so you could look at some more information on it. But I actually saw an article that said that New Hampshire might be considering canceling the moose hunt completely. Is that true?
Yeah, so that is a little deceiving. We wouldn't be considering canceling the moose hunt. What we've done, so we're kind of going through our 10-year planning process to set new goals and objectives for our game species. And with moose, it's fairly well known that, and again, this isn't just New Hampshire either, but moose in, areas like Minnesota, Maine is experiencing the same things. A lot of these areas are experiencing some die-off of moose. So with the declines that we've been seeing in our moose population, we set some population level objectives of where we would try and, we'd like to try and maintain populations, but what we also did was we set thresholds. Basically, if we dropped below a certain level, we would suspend permit issuance, but it would not be a cancellation of the hunt. It would be a suspension of permit issuance until the population rebounded to a specific level, in which, and when it did that, when it got back to that level for, I believe it's there's specific population levels, and I believe it's if they stay at that point for 2 years, then permits would start to be issued again. So it wouldn't really be a canceling of the hunt. It would just be a suspension of permit issuance until the population rebounded to a point where we thought it was, still healthy enough to be able to be harvested.
And let me just clarify that, because the permit issues are based off of zones, and zones are scattered. I forget how many there are, but there's a bunch of them in the state, and each zone, I think it's 23 or 22 zones that you pick that you want to hunt. So you might shut off some in some areas based off of the population there. And is that accurate? Like just the zone, but not?
Yeah, that is accurate. So deer are managed by a wildlife management unit. Moose are a little bit different. They're managed by in management regions, which is kind of a group of different management units. So for moose, there's the Connecticut Lakes region, the North region, Central region, Southwest and Southeast. There may be one more in there that I'm forgetting, but So really with the management units with moose, we still issue permits by management unit, but that's really just to kind of disperse hunting pressure. So you're correct though, but there could be a specific management region within the state that if it falls below that level, that unit might not have permits issued, but if there's another unit that's still above those levels, then the hunt would still go on there. The southeastern part of the state, which is, the kind of that seacoast area similar to where we found those deer.
Right.
That is our most heavily populated portion of the state. So we're not making any proposals to suspend the hunt there. At least not from a population, density perspective. It's more hunter satisfaction. We really don't want to have any sort of high density moose population there just because of concerns with vehicle collisions. There was, I believe, might have even been a fatal collision a number of years back, and when that had happened, people basically, the public basically said they really never want to have that many moose down there. So due to public safety concerns, we'd probably continue a hunt down there unless it got to the point where hunters just were unwilling to hunt down there.
Gotcha.
So that unit is a little different than the rest of the state. Another thing to keep in mind about moose in New Hampshire is that they're pretty much approaching the southern limit of their range, especially in the southern part of the state. So, really southern New Hampshire, it's not great moose habitat. Moose are really dependent on early successional habitat. So it's, in areas where they're doing a lot of cutting. We don't have that really in the southern part of the state. It's starting to get a little warm for them down there as well. They're really built to withstand the cold. So really southern New Hampshire's not particularly a place where you'd ever expect to have a high density moose population. But, so again, there's some differences in what the goals are going to be from area to area in the state. But,
okay.
But yeah, so not a cancellation of the hunt, but just suspension of permits in areas if they drop below certain levels.
Okay. All right. That makes sense. Now, what is it that's causing the population decrease?
So, there's a couple of different things. The main thing, so in the far northern part of the state, that we actually have a research project going on. It's similar to a project that the department did back in, I believe it was, early 2000s. And we have, a number of animals that were collared in the wintertime. We hired a company that came out with helicopters and did some darting but predominantly net gunning the animals from the helicopters to get the collars on them. And basically what we're looking for is causes of mortality. So we have a graduate student from the University of New Hampshire that's kind of heading up the research portion of the project, and he gets mortality signals from these collars when the animals die, and he's basically trying to get out there as quick as he can to determine an actual cause of death. So in the northern part of the state where that study's going on, the predominant cause of death that we're seeing is from winter ticks. It's a specific species of tick that impacts moose. It's not the same species as the black-legged tick or the deer tick that most people are common with, or wood ticks or anything like that. It's its own species, and the issue with winter tick and moose, and winter tick will get on anything that rubs up against them. They'll get on deer or bear or people. But moose really didn't evolve with winter tick the same way deer did. Deer were kind of their primary host, and they evolved with them. So deer are really effective at grooming against winter tick as well as bears and most other species. So when the ticks start getting on the other animals in the spring, or excuse me, the fall rather, they're grooming them off right then and there, so they never develop large quantities of them. Whereas a moose doesn't start grooming until the fall. And what happens is these ticks, I did that in reverse again. The moose doesn't start grooming until the spring. So these ticks attach to moose in the fall. They stay on them all winter long. So winter weather doesn't impact the ticks because they get a nice, comfy, warm place on the moose all winter.
Right.
And then in the springtime when they're adults, they start taking blood meals, mating, and then dropping off to lay eggs. Well, when these ticks are adults and they're taking blood meals, they swell up to the size of a grape. And there's been studies that show that average numbers of these ticks on a single moose is about 30,000. and it can be as many as 150,000 on a single animal.
Wow.
So you can imagine 150,000 ticks full of blood, the size of a grape. That's a lot of blood that an animal is losing in really about a 4-week period.
Wow. Yeah.
So it impacts calves mostly. Typically the most mortality that we see is in calves because basically they're losing so much blood, and during a time of year when they're energetically depleted. It's usually before spring green up comes, so they just cannot replace that blood fast enough. So they die from anemia.
Right.
The other thing that we're seeing is, so typically these ticks, they'll have they're impacted by moose density. So higher moose densities typically lead to more ticks, but also weather. And we're seeing shorter winters. So these shorter winters at the front and the back end, it's doing two things. It's allowing the ticks longer to attach to a moose in the fall.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also, when they're dropping off in the spring, they're landing on dry ground as opposed to on snow. So the tick survival is much higher when they're landing on leaf litter as opposed to on snow. And more of them are surviving, more of them are laying eggs. So you get these years after these short winters, where you get these kind of explosions in tick numbers, and then subsequent large die-offs in the moose population. So, and we're seeing die-offs more frequently than we had in the past because we're seeing less or shorter winters. So that's what we're seeing. Last year, I believe they collared around 40 or so animals both years. We're in the second year of the study. The first year they saw about 60% mortality in the calves. Maine saw 64% or something like that. I believe Maine's doing a similar study in conjunction with us. And this year we thought we were doing good, but really it was just mortality kind of kicked in later, and now we're up. So I checked in with our regional biologist, and he believes we're up around 70% mortality.
Holy smokes.
With our calves. So it's another bad year.
Wow. So, I mean, this causes a problem, not only for the moose, but also for revenue for Fish and Game, because.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I don't know how much money the moose lottery brings in, but it seems like it had become more and more popular every year.
It had, yeah. And, certainly we would generate a fair amount of revenue from that, but, again, our primary concern is the resource and the moose population. And, we've consistently, backed off of permits, for years. And really, we're to the point now that we're issuing so few permits that, it's having, that's really not having an impact on the population. The primary cause of death we're seeing is, we're seeing, these die-offs from winter ticks, particularly with the calves. But the other thing that we're seeing is, even on years where we don't necessarily have a large die-off, yearling moose, for example, they're getting drained, and they're not able to kind of get themselves back into good enough shape. So productivity is dropping off as well in a lot of these areas. A lot of our yearlings aren't reaching kind of the minimum weight that's required to successfully reproduce.
Wow.
So we're not recruiting a lot of calves into the population, and also our yearlings are not they're unproductive. Our twinning rates have dropped off. Productivity rates have dropped off. So really we're older moose tend to do okay. They don't get impacted quite as heavily, but really you need that recruitment to keep that population going, and that's really where we're being impacted.
Okay. So it's more the resource. You're trying to protect that first and foremost, but when the resource was vibrant and it was drawing a lot of attention, you had a lot of apps coming in. That goes back to our second topic that we were covering, is the state of Fish and Game and the revenue generation. So it kind of, this tick is becoming a large problem.
It is, yeah, absolutely. So the other thing, so ticks are the primary cause of mortality that we're seeing in the northern part of the state. That's where our study's going on. We don't have any mortality studies going on, further south or in the central portion of the state. Our best moose habitat's in the northern part of the state, so that's kind of where we're most concerned. we'd like to check things everywhere, but we just don't have the money to do a project that large. But what we think is going on as you move south is that the other thing that really impacts moose is brainworm. And brainworm again it's a parasite that kind of evolved with white-tailed deer, and white-tailed deer are kind of the primary host of brainworm.
Okay.
So this is a worm that is what happens is it's picked up by ground snails, and then as the ground snails climb vegetation, they're kind of inadvertently eaten by either a deer or a moose, and then that worm reproduces in there and it travels through the spinal column and into the brain, and it doesn't impact deer at all for the most part. Deer really don't die from it, except maybe in very rare occurrences. But again, because they've evolved with this parasite, but it's fatal in moose. And typically, kind of the North American experience with brainworm is as you start to get deer densities that exceed about 10 deer per square mile, you start to see increases in moose mortality due to brainworm. And with the exception of kind of the White Mountain area of New Hampshire and some of the further northern portions of the state, we have deer densities that are above 10 deer per square mile. So we believe in the central part of the state and particularly the southern part of the state, brainworm might be having a big impact on the moose population. But again, we don't have a mortality study going on there, and brainworm is actually very difficult to identify in an animal. So it's tough to say, but that's one of the things that we believe is probably impacting moose as you kind of move south and you start getting into higher deer densities.
Fascinating. So the deer population kind of affects the moose population, but not so much in a let's fight over food thing. This is more of a disease type spreading situation. That moose,
absolutely.
But not deer. That's crazy. So can moose do moose affect deer habitat at all, or is it just pretty much seems like deer dominate when it comes down to it?
Yeah. So we don't really see that. There were some studies done back in the 90s in New Hampshire where they looked at how moose browse might impact browse availability for deer in deer yards in the northern part of the state, and there was some potential there for some competition, but by and large, moose don't really act the same way as deer do. Their behavior's different in the winter. They don't, unless it's a really, really, really severe winter, moose really aren't yarding up the same way as deer do. So they kind of, they're in some different habitat types. They don't overlap quite as much as you'd expect. So we don't really think that, and in the northern part of the state, our deer densities are pretty low, or our moose densities they're our highest, but again, they're not overly high either. So we don't really think that there's too much competition in terms of food availability between the two. But certainly parasites is a concern, particularly as you start getting into those higher deer densities.
Okay, interesting. Well, it's just fascinating how moose and deer they all affect each other in some way, shape, or form. It's quite a cycle there. Let's move on to the last subject of the day, and I know Dusty's been waiting for this one.
Okay.
So we are the Big Buck Registry, Dusty and I. This is us. We are the Big Buck Registry, along with 155,000 hardcore deer hunting fans who love big deer. And I named it the Big Buck Registry because I wanted to not exclude small racks, and because a big deer is a big deer is a big deer to me and to Dusty. However, Dusty lives in the land of large racks, and in Ohio there's large racks that are grown in Wisconsin and Saskatchewan and Kentucky. Why is it that New Hampshire is not known for large rack deer? Is it the habitat? Is it the way we hunt? What do you attribute that to?
Yeah, it's primarily two things. It's habitat. It's habitat, which is really in New Hampshire is impacted by our soil productivity, and it's our severe winters. So New Hampshire's the granite state, unfortunately, and we have, there's a reason that everybody moved out west an abandoned, agriculture out here back in the 1800s. It's because you can't grow anything. That's predominantly, why we're probably, not to say that we don't have big deer and we don't have deer with big racks. We certainly do. But again, we're a small state with really unproductive soils, and severe winters. And with deer, particularly near the northern limit of their range, which New Hampshire is getting close to that, their primary concern is putting on body weight, to survive those winters, and antlers are kind of a luxury to deer in areas like that, particularly with unproductive soils. So, their main focus is put on that body weight, and then they start, then that energy starts going to antlers when their body size gets big enough, which is why, as you head to northern latitudes, body size of deer increases from some of those southern areas, because it's more important for them to have those larger bodies. So, we're more known for large bodied deer, as opposed to large antlered deer. And again, the fact that we're sitting on a big slab of granite, it's not going to help with antler growth. Recently, I was looking through some stuff, and our GIS specialist had put a map together for me a couple of years back, and it was deer kill per square mile, in the state, which, it's not 100% correlated with density, but it's a pretty good index of deer density in the state. I then found another map that was generated by, I can't remember where, but they'd used some information from the Department of Agriculture, and it was the most productive agricultural land in different states. And so when you looked at the two maps, they were pretty much identical. In the portions of our state where we have the most productive soils and the most productive agricultural land, it matched up almost perfectly with our deer densities. Which just kind of goes to show you that, where our state is most productive, so is our deer herd. And again, for that matter, so is our turkey flocks. We see the same thing in the southeastern and part of the state along the Connecticut River Valley, where soils are more productive and winters are a little less mild, is, typically where we start seeing more productive deer herds and turkey flocks. And then, but, certainly in the northern part of the state is where we kind of start seeing, larger deer or kind of a more higher percentage of larger deer being taken. But that is more a function of, likely more a function of lower hunting pressure. So you get deer that are living longer up there. So, they're getting to those, 4.5, 5.5 kind of, prime ages where they're getting those, larger antlers. So, unfortunately, New Hampshire is never going to be an area like Ohio or anything like that. We don't have the agricultural areas. We don't have the productive soils, and we got those severe winters. But we do have big bodied deer, and certainly we have some large antlered deer too. Just per capita, not as many as some of those Midwestern states.
Right. I mean, with the exception of the Clucky buck, which I think was an Allenstown buck when it was all said and done, right? There's, there must be some other large deer in the state that I'm not aware of, just from not.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And Roscoe Blaisdell, who runs the New Hampshire Antler Skull and Trophy Club, I was talking to him recently, he has the 200 plus pound, all the deer that are 200 pounds or above, he registers them and enters them into the kind of the trophy book that he of. And, he was actually, I sent him information, from our harvest information, because he only gets a proportion of the deer, because not everybody that necessarily shoots a large deer registers it with him. And he was always under the assumption, I believe he said that there was maybe 40% of people that didn't call him. It actually ended up being closer to about 60% of people who never, 60% of people that shot a buck that was 200 pounds or larger, never registered it with the trophy deer program.
Oh, wow.
So there was quite a few more, large body deer being taken at the state that he was aware of. I think part of the problem that he thought maybe was happening was that people just were under the assumption that when they registered at the registration station that information was given to him, but they actually have to contact him or fill out a sheet that's in our hunting digest to kind of have it officially recognized. There has to be a witness, and it has to be the weight has to be verified by someone at the station. So
Gotcha. Okay.
So I think a lot of people were, might have been under the impression that if it's 200 pounds and you register it, it just gets recorded, but that's not the case. So,
hey Dan, I'll be the first to tell you. I think it was Dean Vineyard from Northwoods Common Sense. There, we was talking to him, Jay. And he was off the mic, and he said, "Man, I got a 180 last year, and the year before I got a 200." And I'm thinking, my gosh, New Hampshire's the greatest state to hunt whitetails in.
Right.
I was thinking it was talking about scores, and then the conversation went on. I'm like, man, I'm jealous. I got 174 incher on the wall, but I don't have no 200s or 180s. And I'm like, man, that's a great buck, Dean. I was all jazzed up talking to Jay and Dean, and he's like, yeah, 200-pound buck's a pretty good buck, eh?
Yeah.
I'm like, what? 200 pounds? I thought you saw about antler size.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It flipped me off. New Hampshire definitely has got the big weights. I mean, every time we talk to somebody in New Hampshire, they're like, man, this buck weighed 180, 210, 200. I'm like, wow, that's a great buck. But what I don't understand is, how do they grow the massive bodies with the small antlers? That's something that throws me for a loop.
Yeah, and again, it's like I said, it's that all their energy is going into growing that body. So their antlers come second. So,
right, correct.
Every little bit of energy that they're taking in, it's going to growing that body, and then they start worrying about the antlers. So, in areas where there's not severe winters, they only have to grow, their body size only has to get so large to be able to carry them through a winter. So they can more quickly kind of start divvying that energy out to start growing a larger rack. That on top of the fact that, if you got areas where there's, just expansive agriculture going on, they're just taking more energy in as well, and they don't need to, they don't need to grow as large of a body. So there's less they're putting in there. There's more they're putting into their antlers, and there's just kind of more in general that they're getting, and then they're not burning it up over the winter. They don't have to really cut into their fat stores like a deer in New Hampshire would.
Right.
So when the spring comes, they're right back to a good weight. Whereas, deer in New Hampshire after a severe winter, if it even recovers fully the following year, it's going to take a while. So it's just, it's a rough life for really wildlife in areas like this. And, it's kind of similar, New Hampshire, when we're talking about moose and deer, and, we're kind of at that nexus where we're right there near the northern limit of deer range, near the southern limit of moose range. And historically it's, animals don't thrive near the edges of their range.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. That's self-explanatory there. Let me ask you this. If you're a large landowner, there is a capability of doing the proper nutrition systems and planting the right things in New Hampshire to make the deer antler growth better. That's kind of something I wanted to ask is it possible to take where the antler size is not the greatest in some areas there, and it's definitely noticeable. Is there a possibility that you can take the dirt there and turn it into some antler growing nutritional value dirt?
Yeah, absolutely, Pete. There's certainly things that landowners can do. There's, you could get pretty intense with it, where you could start throwing fertilizers down. I'm more of a traditionalist where I kind of, I'm more about, trying to promote natural foods and things like that. But that's not to say, that's not putting down anybody that does anything else. I'm just a little more traditional that way. But, certainly, there's things people can plant. There's forestry practices people can do that can increase, food that's on their property, cutting, promoting, oak. If you go in and do some thinning and you get those oaks to grow and release them from some competition, they can produce more acorns. And, if you get some fruit trees, you get an old apple, some kind of old apple fields or something that you can work with. So there's definitely things landowners can do. And really, in a state like New Hampshire, anything that you're doing to increase, food availability for these deer, is going to be beneficial to them. And it's going to help, if they can get more energy in them. It's either more, it's less that they have to go out and find, it's less energy they have to expend searching for it. And they're putting more in, so they're able to grow both their body and their antlers faster. So yeah, there are certainly things people could do. And any type of management like that you do on your property, whether it's promoting natural stuff or, if you're into food plots, it's going to help. Particularly if you can combine that with, if you get some deer that are, getting up to some older ages too, which, depending on where you are in the state, southern part of the state, we got some pretty good, hunting pressure down there. But if those deer can get old and you can get them some good browse and some good, food availability, and certainly that they're going to get bigger than they would without it.
Absolutely. What's just throwing it out there? What's the deer herd looking like in New Hampshire for the years to come?
Yeah, it's looking good. We had a stretch of extremely mild winters, which really helped our population grow. We had, I think in the last 6 years, I want to say we had 3 of the mildest winters on record. These past 2 winters have been more severe, so that's going to impact the deer. This past winter, we don't really feel like it impacted them as much as you would have suspected from how the winter played out. There was a really good acorn crop going into the fall, so deer were probably going in pretty good shape. The snow came late, so it didn't really come until the very end of January, and so the month of February was brutal, but it was a pretty, in the grand scheme of things, it was a fairly short period of time with really bad weather. And then on top of that, the snow was pretty fluffy, which was beneficial for deer to move around and not so much for predators. It's tough for a bobcat or a coyote to move in, snow that's over their heads.
Right.
Whereas a deer can move through that a little more easier if it's not crusted over, and they can push through that. The other thing we were seeing, we all of the biologists do deer yard surveys in the wintertime to kind of just keep an eye on that habitat as well as look for, deer mortality. And, we were all seeing deer were staying pretty mobile, and they were able to actually dig for acorns throughout a good portion of the winter. And winter ended kind of, a little bit later than it has been, but again, so some areas still haven't seen green up, but I know certainly at my house, I'm still stumbling around in the woods, slipping on acorns. There's so many out there. So
yeah,
that acorn crop we had, I think, was very beneficial to them going into winter, and both during and now after winter, getting a good food source for them. That combined with the light snow. So, we saw a reduction in harvest last year, which was expected. We'll probably see another one this coming year, I would assume, with this winter. But that being said, the deer herd has grown by about 20,000 or so over the last 10 years. We're consistently having, kind of record harvest levels. So the deer herd's looking good. They're healthy. Our antler, beam diameters, our weights are consistent. We're not seeing really any declining trends in that. So health of the deer are really good. So we're looking good. We don't, again, because of where we are, we don't have a lot of numbers, but, our deer are very healthy, and, we got a lot more than we had 20 years ago or so. So they're looking good.
Awesome.
Very good.
Yeah. Where's the next state record buck going to come from? What county?
Oh, geez. That's tough. That's a tough question because we seem to, we got a kind of spattering of deer all over the place that, getting some nice deer. Typically they come from Pittsburgh. That would probably be your safest bet because that seems to be where kind of the majority of our 200 plus pound deer are getting taken, kind of up in that area. So, just odds, I would say probably there, but, you never know. We get, sometimes you get in these southern portions of the state that are heavily developed. I know a couple of years ago there was a 240 some odd pound buck that came out of Bedford, New Hampshire. And likely it got into some of those suburban neighborhoods and it was basically a refuge during the hunting season, and put some age on him, and he was able to get up to that big size. So, you never know. That's the thing. You never know where they're going to come from. And again, we typically have, when I'm looking at them, they're kind of coming from all over the place, but the majority of the bigger ones usually do come from further north. When you start getting into you get out of the White Mountains, although some get taken there too, but hunting pressure is just so low there. You're not seeing a lot getting taken there, but.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, before we let you go, Dan, I got just a couple quick questions. I want to see if you could leave us with some answers to these questions. They're basic, but if you had to recommend just one tool that you need to bring into the woods with you every time you go in the woods, what would it be?
A weapon.
A weapon. Good. I like that one. That's a good answer. All right.
You're not going to get a deer without one.
That's a good point.
No, geez, boy. I guess it's not really. I guess it's not really something you're bringing out with you. It's something you're doing ahead of time. And I guess it's a good map and knowing what direction the wind's coming from.
Yeah.
I'm a little bit more on the side of paying attention to wind and things like that than I am about worrying about scent control clothing or a really, really great camo pattern. I've gotten extremely close to deer stinking to high heaven during some of my field work, and it was because, the wind just was favoring me. So, I think that's one of the most important things to keep in mind.
Gotcha. And if you could recommend one book for deer hunters, which would it be?
Oof. Geez, that's a tough one.
Okay.
Most of the stuff that I've read over the years has been research related. So I guess I guess that's what I would recommend. I wouldn't necessarily recommend a book. Get into some of those research papers because there's a lot of good stuff to be learned that can aid you in hunting by reading some of those papers. Some of them are a little tough to follow, but there's some good stuff out there that if you can start finding some of those, you find one and there's references in the back to all the others, makes it easier to find them. But, there's a lot of important stuff that you can learn about deer behavior and that is very beneficial if you can apply that in your hunting skills.
Yeah, that makes sense. Research papers. And where would we find some of these papers if we wanted to check them out?
It can be tricky because some of them, you need to get subscriptions to, but, really, if you get on the internet and you just start Googling something that you might be interested in, usually you get some stuff that starts popping up and eventually you find something. But, I will say that QDMA's website, they're pretty good at giving some research-based references. But, so that's maybe a starting point. But, once you start getting into some of them, it starts getting easier to find others. But, I typically would get them through the university. Now that I'm not there, we got some subscriptions to some of these journals from the department. So,
gotcha.
Wildlife Society, so the Wildlife Journal is a good one. But there's a site, I believe it's Bio1, and that's you get I don't think you necessarily, not everything is, you get the full story, but you get the abstracts, and then, if you get the names, you can start finding links to them in other places. So, and sometimes too, like DNR websites, we'll have some information with links to research papers like that as well.
Sure.
The other thing to do is, if you got a local cooperative extension, so if there's a university extension program, there's likely somebody there that can, or just your fish and game department, you can call up the biologist and maybe they can get you, some specific references.
Gotcha. Excellent. Dusty, any last questions for Dan before we let him go?
No, I sure don't, Dan. We really appreciate you joining us.
Yeah, not a problem. My pleasure.
Dan, where can we reach you if people are listening to this show and they have further questions? Can they reach out to you at the Fish and Game Department somehow?
Yeah, absolutely. The number to our wildlife division is 603-271-2461, and they can just call up and ask for me.
Excellent, man. Thanks for joining us on the Big Buck Podcast.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I can't thank Dan enough for joining us and going deep into all those subjects. I wanted to know a lot more about what happened out there in Kingston, and now we know.
Yeah, it's one of them subjects that was huge for a lot of readers.
It was.
It's very informal, but there were some untied loose ends with that.
Right.
And I feel like we chased after that and maybe tied up some of them loose ends.
Yeah, Dan was very informative. Glad we learned a lot about all the subjects between what's going on at Fish and Game and raising money and the moose hunt and how it relates to deer. I didn't realize that, the deer and moose habitats and certain biologies and infectious diseases actually carry over from species to species, where it affects the moose way more than it affects the deer, and the deer are actually the carriers. I had no idea about that. And then we just, I think we kind of sealed the deal about New Hampshire being the granite state. Nothing grows here, so there's no chance of having a giant antler in New Hampshire for the most part, other than certain areas.
Yeah, it's almost like you got to build a buck there.
I agree. Chubby Tine's tip of the week. Do we have one?
We do, and I'm going to get into a little preparation for a few months away that the whitetail season's coming. And here on the Big Buck Registry, we're all about big bucks. If you get a moment and you've still got tree stands out in the woods, you need to go and give your straps a little bit of a release on letting the tree have some room to growth.
Good one.
And that's something that more and more I see that, oh man, I went out there and my stands all dug into the tree. Well, what good's that do?
Right.
That opens up the tree for some damage to the bark and the internals of the tree, seeing moisture all the time. So, take a couple hours one Saturday morning. And I know everybody's turkey hunting, but if you're turkey hunting, you're usually out in the woods that you're deer hunting in. Take a few minutes and throw your safety harness on, climb up and just release that ratchet strap. Take that pressure off, retighten it down enough where you can climb down safely and let it be for the summer.
Right.
And then we'll get into fall preparation later. And I'll remind you then that, hey, if you give your tree room to grow, you need to go retighten up everything and check everything out. You should do that naturally. Safety first, but let's think about the trees that them stands hang in all summer.
Good point. It's a good point, and often overlooked. We often forget about those during this time of year. So.
Absolutely.
Well, where can we find you, Dusty?
Yeah, you go to Chubby Tines, Facebook.com/Chubby Tines Outdoors. You can send me an email, Dusty@BigBuckRegistry.com. Jay, where can the people reach you when you're not on the mic?
Well, you can find me at BigBuckRegistry.com. You can always shoot me an email, Jay@BigBuckRegistry.com. Of course, Dusty, we are now featured on the Outdoor Podcast channel, which is a channel on iTunes, but also at OutdoorPodcastChannel.com. You can find us over there. As far as going to our Facebook page, Facebook.com/BigBuckRegistry. Twitter is Twitter.com/BigBuckRegistry. You can find us on the Prepper Broadcasting Network as well. And if you'd like to submit the giant buck that you shot over the last year, or maybe even if it's a Throwback Thursday from way back, send that into it's BigBuckRegistry.com/mybuck. And I think that's it, Dusty. Did I forget anything?
Big buck everywhere. Big buck. Yeah. You want, if you got a small business and you're looking to sponsor, Jay, you want to mention something about that?
Absolutely. We have set up a new sponsorship situation here. So if you are an outdoor podcast lover, and if you have a product that you think would be suited to the outdoor deer hunter, and you would like to get some exposure and you haven't done so yet, maybe a small company, big company, or anything in between, we do have a sponsorship set up now. And you can go and check out all of our rates, find out how many downloads we get, find out who our people are, who our listeners are, who our fan base is. You can go to BigBuckRegistry.com/sponsor. And you can download the infographic right there, give you a quick synopsis of what's going on behind the scenes. And you can also get all the little details about who listens to this show, who's on our Facebook page, and find out who our Big Buck Nation truly is. And it's all right there at BigBuckRegistry.com/sponsor. I think that's it, man.
Awesome.
Yeah, that was a good show.
Absolutely.
I'm Jay Scott.
And I'm Dusty Phillips.
This is the Big Buck Registry's Big Buck Deer Hunting Podcast. See you next week.
Can't wait.